What do you want me to say?
Say the following word. N-O.
No.
Okay.
Why?
I like the way you guys say it, but some people say it with more like no,
No.
it's like two syllables almost. No, you don't do it as much, but you do it.
You say it.
No, it's like no, no. But you guys are like
Oh, it's so short when you
no.
say it though.
You guys
It's
have like a long.
yeah.
Some people really draw it out. I like it a lot. I don't know why I
Oh,
like it a lot. I just do.
but yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well,
In so to be authentic, then remind me what we're talking about.
that's super authentic. So today, Stephanie, we were going to talk about snacking after dinner.
Yes.
And the reason why we're talking about this is because this is just a subject that lots of people are interested in.
Mm. You know what I feel like? I feel like I want to be asked questions.
Yeah.
Will you
Okay.
ask me a question?
I'll ask
Or
you a
start, or
question.
you could start.
Okay. Um, what do you think about snacking after dinner?
That's not fair. It's not fair. That's too broad. Okay, fine. I'll just start talking about it. I know that I used to snack after dinner relentlessly. It was my primo snacking time. Well, I also would snack in the afternoon. If it was either before dinner or after dinner, it was always surrounding dinner. That was always such a hard time. Um, and that now I don't snack if at all after dinner. A lot of times dinner is the last time I eat.
What
Um,
changed?
well, recovery obviously like the beginning of it, but in recent years, my desire for eating has just waned in the evening and I want to eat more earlier. I'll snack more in the afternoon than I will at night, but I actually don't really snack that much. It's much more. I can't believe I'm saying that. And I'm sorry. I apologize for it because I feel like it's so one of those things that I used to be like, like it's so privileged almost, it feels like to not feel that. But I just have found more value in being hungrier for my meals and snacks where because they do exist in certain places in my day, like religiously, like they're just there. But I don't find myself snacking between those times anymore because it has decreased the amount of satisfaction I get from my food, which is something you talked about first before that became a reality for me, actually, because you've talked about that for a long time,
I was
right?
just thinking that because early on when we first started this podcast, like snacking was quite an important part, seemed like quite an important part of your
Yeah,
eating throughout the day.
it was. And it isn't anymore, except the mid-afternoon snack. That's like for me standard. Can't go through a day without that. But snacking doesn't really exist otherwise, unless I mean circumstances will change that up. And so does I mean day to day. But generally, I don't I don't. And that has shifted over the course of even just recording this podcast.
I remember when I first had any kind of treatment for binge eating, and it was the CBT approach, 3 meals and 3 snacks. So you'd have a snack between breakfast and lunch, you'd have one between lunch and dinner, and you would have one after dinner, like 9
Yeah.
p.m.
Yeah.
And I remember at the time feeling like, not beforehand, when they told me, I was like, okay, I'll do this. But then when I'm actually doing it, thinking, for me, this feels like I'm thinking about, not thinking about, but like having to deal with food all the time or six
Mhm.
times a day, having to deal with food. And something in like in me and my psychology that felt a little bit counterintuitive just to the way that I think, which is not to say that, of course, when I hadn't been following this and I would be binging, often it wasn't snacking so much. I have had days where I would graze throughout the day, and that might be a day perhaps when I'm particularly hormonal or if I've been out for a few drinks or something like that. But for me, I am perfectly comfortable with snacking. If it's 3 or 4 o'clock and I feel like I'm hungry and the thought occurs to me that I want a snack, I'll have a snack.
Mhm.
Or if I'm somewhere and someone offers me something
Mm.
that just looks good, I'll have a snack. It's not a routine for me.
Mm.
But having said that, I really do see how for many people that approach is really helpful in recovery to
Which
have your
one?
3 meals and the snacks.
Yes. Yeah, the
So
anchor snacks. kind of
Yeah,
thing.
and to know that food is coming within a couple of hours and all of that can be very regulating
Yeah,
kind of biologically.
yeah,
So this is not me saying like, oh, I don't think this works for people. I'm just very much through my own experience. I have always been someone like prior to struggling with food as well, who liked to have substantial meals. I can
yeah.
remember I would go out with people to restaurants and I would finish other people's foods at
Hmm.
dinner time and stuff like that. And there was no shame about it because,
Yeah.
I was in a thin body. So there was like,
Mm.
I wasn't worried about weight. I wasn't feeling judged by anyone. People would remark on it as a way of like, I can't believe that you can eat that much. But then I never thought about food between meals. And so I think that was just part of my
Where
early
you are.
conditioning before food got complicated and weird.
Well, I was going to say that actually what I notice now is that I don't really snack so much now, except for that mid-afternoon one, but I eat really big meals. So my meals are substantial. But when I was in the first 2 to 3 years of recovery, I had substantial meals and snacks. Like, I don't think it's like, oh, well, if you eat really big, substantial meals, you shouldn't need snacks.
Mm-hmm.
For some people, that might be true. And I recognize this discrepancy. There seems to be two different experiences physiologically about needing snacks or not. Like when you were saying it's too much thinking about food, that was never my issue because I'd be thinking about it anyway. So it was more like, it was more that anchor of safety of like, okay, I get to have a big breakfast. I also get to have a snack. I also get to have a big lunch. I also get to have a big snack. I get to have a big dinner and I get to have a snack. Like that was like, ooh, good to go thing. But now I don't need the snacks. It just, my body doesn't need it. It doesn't like ask me for it except for the afternoon time. And I know we're talking about evening, like specifically. But I think that what used to happen was that evening post dinner snacking was going on because I had not eaten enough during my day and I need more food than the average human. Like I think I wrote about this on Instagram this morning. I have a big appetite. I think people with heartier appetites don't get discussed enough in intuitive eating. I need more food than I was ever taught I needed. And now that I'm having that, I think that I don't need to snack as much at night to catch up, which is what my body was really trying to do when I was trying to have like a certain amount at each meal and other reasons that we talk about separately.
I would just like to change my answer though on one of the things that I just said. It wasn't that the snacking meant I had to think about food more often. I misspoke. It's that I had to make decisions,
Mm.
more decisions. So it was more in that aspect. Yes, you're thinking about food, but having to make more decisions and planning and obtaining food. Ugh, like
Oh,
I just
see, it's like you'd rather not eat than do that because I would have been like,
no,
great, I
I
get
just
to
I just
choose.
rather eat bigger meals so that I don't have to navigate
Oh,
more
see, I just
decisions.
wanted food anyway. I needed to have that food even if I was hungry or not. I just needed to know I could eat.
Hmm.
Um, to not eat would be so much worse. I also think it might be worth us talking about, this feels really important, the difference between, which I would never have made this distinction, but I am now, snacking and grazing. Because
Hmm.
the way that I think about snacking now is actual snacks, like that have a beginning and an end, like they're on purpose and they're intentional, and I put them on a plate. Or, I mean, not always, but like what I'm saying is they're purposeful, they're intentional. But grazing is probably more of what I used to do at night, grazing through the night. And that was different than snacking.
Hmm. I think ultimately for me, when I started planning to eat more, I just felt more satisfied at dinner time. So grazing for me, when I think of days that perhaps when it was more of a struggle compared to even days when I might have a more grazing day now, for me, grazing would happen through the afternoon and even back then. So I would say my nighttime eating was big binges that would keep me awake till 3 a.m. in the morning. And if it wasn't a big binge, I normally wasn't eating so much after dinner. It was very kind of all or nothing for
Mm,
me. And I think because I would have
yeah.
got in a battle with myself about whether to eat something or not after a meal, that's what would have turned probably just wanting something into a binge anyway. It was the fact I'm getting in this mental battle with
Yeah.
myself about the food, not to mention Last Supper eating. that was a huge one. So it's worth mentioning. Are we talking about evening snacking, or are we talking about, getting to the end of the day feeling like you've blown it? So,
Yeah.
stuff it.
Right.
Let's just like get everything in that we can, because tomorrow
Yeah.
we're going to do a much better job at this eating thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I kind of would like to spend a little bit more time talking about the former thing you said, like the people who aren't necessarily doing that Last Supper, because I don't think we talk. I feel like I'm always like, what restriction? Restriction? That's why. But what if it isn't? What if it's like you're not necessarily restricting during the day, or at least not in a big obvious way, and then you're sort of feeling that snackiness post evening. And one of the reasons that I can think about that isn't to do with restriction is like that period of time being dark and quieter. Maybe the kids are in bed. Maybe it's the sigh of relief at the end of the day, like everything's done. We can relax now. And it feels like a reward. It feels
Mhm.
like what we're living for. It's this comfort at the end of a night that absent of the food might feel empty.
And I think we have an episode
I
called
know. I'm like, wait, we have
I
an episode on this.
but I use food as a reward. Let me just find out the number. I'm going to guess it to be it's going to be something like
42.
83. 15. We could probably do another
We
episode on
should.
food as a reward.
Yeah.
And we were going to do another one on like dopamine, weren't we?
Yes.
But yes. So, yeah. But I use food as a reward. Episode 15. I would say when the podcast was still finding its feet, but we hit the ground running.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, no, that makes me also think of, yes, the whole thing where it's like, this is my me time, the thing to look
Yeah.
forward to at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Also, for me, slightly different to that, but very similar as well, was just feeling so depleted at the end of the day and trying to draw energy back in. So it's not, doesn't feel quite like reward, but it's just almost like, because I'm tired, I need some kind of stimulation. I need to draw energy
Yeah.
into myself. And I'm going to reach for sweet stuff to do that.
Yeah. I think that idea of stimulation is really important. And when I think sometimes about how late I used to stay up, because I was such a night owl, actually, when I was having trouble with food more so. And I think I was pushing myself beyond the limits because I go to bed early now. I get tired by 9 and I go to bed now. But I think what I was doing was staying up like 3 to 4 hours beyond where my body wanted to. And I was potentially using food to stay awake,
Mhm.
or to just make staying awake feel more tolerable because I wanted to stay awake. Like that was my me time. I didn't want the day to end and I would prolong it. But then I needed food almost to do that.
So, what would you say to somebody who is in that position?
Well, my first thing is always just kind of noticing that. So to put the query submission in to your inner anthropologist, like, is that potentially what the role of food is doing? Is that the point here? Is that what the food is doing for me? Because that would be good information to know. And then if you found that it was, let me think about it. Well, there's a case to be made for saying, like, if that's what your body is doing, like, okay, then there's a certain acceptance of that. There's also potentially being more intentional about it because I wonder how many times our body's asking for that kind of stimulation, going towards food, we're then judging that or trying to fight it. And then that itself is creating maybe more grazing slash snacking than would otherwise need to be happening. So being intentional about saying, yes, I need food in my PM hours, that's something that keeps me feeling awake. That's something that keeps me going. That's something that keeps me comforted during this time that I need this higher level of stimulation. I'm excited to choose what it's going to be, and like having that with more purpose rather than with resistance, which I think would be typically might be going on.
I got to a point, and I can, do this now with, 90% accuracy, probably. I don't know where I plucked that number from, mostly accurate, where when I have a desire for a food, I can tell the difference with when it's really the desire because I want that food, and when it's like a feeling that I want the food, but I know the food isn't going to quite hit the spot. I
Mm.
now can kind of tell the difference in advance, which I couldn't
Yeah.
before. Before it was too unclear and I was stressed about even wanting the food. So
How do you
this,
feel it?
So there was a couple of things that I did because there was, as someone who was, I would say, more at the permissive end of the spectrum, there were times when I would eat or be drawn to eat foods that had nothing to do with restriction. It would be like an emotional trigger or even a habit. And so when it was an emotional trigger, there were two things that helped me at the beginning to kind of discern. Is one, if I wanted the food and I could really imagine myself just eating the food without being switched off at the same time. I could really imagine just having the food and enjoying and being in the experience and connected to the experience of eating the food. If I could experience that, and this had to be judgments are falling away at this point, because if you're judging yourself, then it's
Yeah.
going to feel impossible to do that. Then I got that sense, like when I thought about it like that, I could feel in my body that I still wanted the food. But when I tried to think about it that way, and let's say it was more about trying to get rid of an itchy feeling, it wasn't really because I actually fancied the food and that food was going to really fully satisfy me. I would feel like a resistance to the idea of that, to the idea of just like sitting and noticing and just like really enjoying the food in some way. And I'm not talking about perfect mindful eating. It could be that I have something on the TV, but I'm still connected and tasting and noticing the food, like that being a piece of it as well. So that a little bit like when we had the episode the other week about stress eating, when I thought about that food that was in my fridge that I didn't want, it was like I could imagine eating the food. I could imagine it in my body, and I didn't want that.
Yeah.
So didn't want that. And it's a similar kind of thing. Like I feel it in my body that's just going, no. But it's not possible
No.
to navigate
Did
that.
it?
Did I?
Yeah.
It's not possible to navigate that when you think you shouldn't have the food. So a big part of my recovery was much more about it doesn't matter what I eat. It really matters to me the experience of eating it, what the like emotional energy is around eating it, and like learning these different outcomes, I think was a big part.
Mm.
And there were times as well when I might feel a craving. And if the craving was really intense, and I was confident I hadn't been restricting as well, craving was really intense. I can remember a couple of times just going, like, I'm just going to go and lie down with this feeling. So it was like a moving towards the feeling, but it was by lying down,
Mm.
that strong urge or desire created like a contraction and a tension in my body because I want this thing and I'm conflicted about it and I can feel that tightening in my body. So by going, okay, I want this thing, I'm going to go and lie down with it. And again, like I sometimes am reluctant to say some of this stuff because I
Mm.
imagine people going like, oh, what a great tip. I'm going to go and do that tip, but I'm just going to share it anyway and just be careful of adopting other people's tip with the hope of going, well, that should give me this outcome. Now I've forgotten what the tip was.
Laying down.
So yeah, the laying down and the softening into the feeling. Oh yeah, because I would say things to myself sometimes, and this is the thing that might not be helpful for other people, especially if there's still like a restrictive mindset going on. I would say things like, you can have this food as soon as it feels like a peaceful decision, because I don't want to eat this food while I'm feeling conflicted with myself. Because when I eat it in this conflicted state, I struggle to find satisfaction. So then I'm
Yeah.
eating it
Yeah.
conflicted. I've eaten the food. It hasn't got rid of this feeling. And now I'm feeling
Yeah.
like I've blown it. And now I just want to go and eat more food.
When I listen to the way that you process, I'm like, there's a certain amount of agitation I get. Remember in the episode we recorded about stress and we were talking about you getting on the yoga mat when you were at this like higher level? It almost feels like that to me. It feels like this slowing down and waiting to be peaceful is run so counter to like the urgency like in myself that I have, that I've always attributed to restriction, like that restrictive urgency, which 100%, if you've got restriction, that urgency is really up there. But even not that, even just kind of my more anxiousness, there's something so hard about doing that. Like that makes me almost feel rebellious right away. That tempered when my restriction came down, but it still might be present for some people who run anxious. And if that's the case, I still think that's a helpful thing to notice. Is the desire to eat coming from the desire to eat, or is it coming from almost the absence of wanting to slow down? And that actually lends itself to something else I want to say, which I hesitate also to say because it's not going to be helpful in some circles of listeners. But I actually found that my nighttime snacking, grazing, binging was worse when I was not in any kind of habit of moving at all. Meaning when I wasn't releasing energy from my body in some kind of way on some kind of a regular basis, regulish, not like daily, it doesn't have to be like that, but going for walks or going to a bar class or whatever it might have been, when I wasn't getting that energy out of my body, this would show up at night. And then the tools of slowing, listening, peacefulness, it was like there's a clearing I got to do first before that's going to even be a little bit accessible to me. And there's a relationship, I think, between having some kind of movement in our life and food. And I do not mean exercise in that way. I mean the natural state of humans needing to move somewhat to get energy through their bodies. And I think that especially if you run anxious, that not even just it, same with depression or neither, like that we do need to be moving that through. And that connected when you were just talking about that, because I think there's been a relationship between my decreased snacking need from a non-restrictive place and my movement accessibility.
Mm-hmm. I can really relate to that as well. And I know it is a sticky thing to say to a wide range of people with lots of different experiences. And I find that when I haven't moved for a long time, and when I mean by haven't moved, I mean I've just been sitting a lot.
Yeah.
I find that my hunger and fullness cues, both of them, are less sensitive.
Yeah.
Which means because my hunger's less sensitive, my appetite's still there. So I still want to eat. It's not like, oh, I'm not hungry and I don't feel like eating. I still want to eat because there's an appetite. But because it's not that kind of hunger, I think that's partly what affects the feeling of satisfaction.
Yeah.
I have seen clients that once they've started moving, has been a huge piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
Huge piece of it. And for other people, it's not a big part of it at all.
Mm.
And of course, there's some people that really have a lot of psychological and emotional stress and even trauma around exercising and moving body, not to mention privilege and physical accessibility and all of those aspects as well. But I think it is a piece that is worth probably coming up in the conversation a bit more, but in a really sensitive way.
Well, I also think it's important to have the conversation because it lends an insight into movement that is not based on what it's usually talked about. Like the value of moving can be regulating and moving this angst through, not losing weight. Like that is the value of it for me. I will also say that there's going to be another subset of people who potentially exercise, move, whatever, and find themselves hungrier at night because if restrictions happening, you will be hungrier at night, right? So the restriction combination matters.
Yeah. I also found with certain high intensity exercise, it then becomes really hard for me to be satisfied.
Yes,
like
me
there's
too.
there's a limit where I find it quite disruptive to my appetite.
Same. That's a whole nother thing. There's something else I wanted to say. Oh, I had a client that I worked with 4 years ago text me yesterday. We worked together for about a year. She texted me to say, and I want to explain why I'm reading this. She said, I feel like I should pay you a royalty for every time I hear your voice in my head saying, do you want comfort food or do you want comfort? Do you even remember saying that to me? But the reason that I bring it up is because I remember when we were working on this, we had worked on restriction, we had worked through that, and there was still eating that was going on that seemed like more of what I said I wanted to talk about, right? Like this non-restrictive based desire for grazing or that sort of thing. And for this particular person, there was a comfort, like the role that food was serving in the evenings was comfort. And so we talked about the difference between wanting comfort food versus wanting comfort, which is tricky, because we don't want to pathologize or demonize anything. And that was not the spirit in which this was discussed. But it took a long time for that awareness to even become actionable in any way. So I want to say that you might spend a long time feeling like maybe comfort is what I'm after in the evenings. Like that might be the reason I'm eating. And that might not change a darn thing for a long time. And with this particular client, that thought, processing that and deconstructing that took, I would say, 3 to 6 months, and that's just for her. And that just because you have an awareness of what might be going on doesn't mean something necessarily changes. And that's something else. Because I think that sometimes we think because something's not working and an insight isn't working, that is a sign that it's not an insight.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Yes.
And also there's nothing wrong. Like, I'm again, not to demonize wanting comfort food or wanting to eat, but I think that, that is something that sometimes goes on, that we are using food for comfort because that is what it is wired to do. It is comforting.
I think it comes to because I absolutely have used food at times to feel comfort and have no problem with it. Sometimes even just my regular dinner can be comforting. Like food can be comforting for me that doesn't necessarily feel like quote unquote overeating. Not a fan of that word. And sometimes I would be quote unquote overeating for comfort. But I guess part of it for me is there a detrimental effect to that? So let's say I was in a chronic state of needing comfort. And so I felt like this was something I was doing every day, every evening, all throughout the evening. And I'm noticing that I'm not feeling good physically about that, maybe emotionally about that. That gets a little stickier because, we're trying to pull away from the judgment lens of looking at this as a right or wrong thing. And this is why I think sometimes people feel quite left out of certain conversations about recovery from disordered eating.
I agree.
Because it makes it then tricky to say, I am not comfortable with this level of I'm just going to use the word overeating again because I can't find a better word in this moment. And it's not restrictive. But if there is a history of restriction, we need to really look out for that sneaky restrictive thinking coming in, or the moralization. There's a difference between, I don't know, if I had a week where I was feeling low and I just found myself grazing a lot more or eating a lot more, I could come to the end of that week and go like, man, I don't feel great about like my food choices this week and how I've been feeling and how I've been using food. And there's something here that needs my attention versus judging or blaming myself or saying I shouldn't have done that or like do you know what I mean?
Yes, I
It's a
do.
whole different energy of self-flagellation of like I should have done it differently. Like
Yes.
the other week when I spoke about
Mm-hmm.
ordering the Dominoes when I was really stressed. I didn't tumble into like, oh, I should have done this differently. Come on, Sarah, this is what you do for a living. I'm like, no, I'll just use it as fodder for the podcast. It's fine.
That's such a truth. I feel like that's the most important thing to say. I think that it is fair for people to feel like they want to address evening snacking, evening eating in a way like and allow that to be something that feels like an issue or like that it bothers somebody without necessarily feeling like you can't talk about it because then you're restricting or you're demonizing the fact that you're eating because you're allowed to eat comfort eat. That's why like part and parcel of recovery to me, I don't think you can recover. I don't think without deconstructing moralization of food. I just think you can't. But once you do, I think it's fair to look at, and not that that's like a one and done either, but with that awareness in mind, yes, you can absolutely be saying, I eat a lot of food at night. I do a lot of comfort eating or overeating at night, and it bothers me. That's fair. I feel like, again, to your point, it's left out of the conversation because we're afraid to touch it because it also has in it restrictive and morality things that when those aren't looked at are absolutely front and center. Like that's part of the problem there. But then what about the people who are saying, I have looked at that. I have deconstructed that. That is something I've been working on really hard. And it's still happening for me. I need help. That's who I think we're speaking to here.
And I think it's understanding one, being able to name what is it that that food is giving you. So, like when you spoke about your client with comfort, she has this question now, which in those moments, the question, your voice lives rent free in her head,
Mm-hmm.
asking her this question. And when we can see what it is, it then becomes, I mean, that's just a reframe almost with that question, isn't it? Because in the moment, all you would normally be aware of is, oh, I want the food. Like, I want that feeling of eating the food. I want the food. I want the food. But even in the asking of the question, it interrupts like a habitual cycle.
Yeah.
So we're kind of talking about habits here as well.
Yes.
I think questions are great for interrupting the habitual cycle. I think if there is a lot of distress and tension around what you're eating, I feel like there might be a bit of emotional work around the judgments you're having about this, which may need to happen before behavior change is going to be possible. Otherwise, it's going to be a battle with your behavior. And we don't want to turn this into a battle. Like that's going to just take you straight back to disordered eating. But also, Steph, how many times have you worked with people who are adamant that this restriction isn't a part of it?
So much.
And then you dig under it and you're like,
that is exactly what I do in my head.
And it's like, okay, how do I say this in the least what's the word?
Yeah.
In the least
confrontational.
I don't want to make anybody feel defensive.
Accusational. Yeah.
And it's not helpful to just say to someone, I think you're restricting.
Yeah.
So it's often just very astute questions, isn't it, Steph? You just got to ask the right questions.
Let them come to it.
Like a little game of word Jenga to try and make those pieces fall.
Yeah. It is very, very common to hear that is actually underneath it. However, I have worked with people who I have gone in and thought, there must be some restriction going on under here. And then it isn't. And that's who I think gets left out of the conversation.
Yes.
Because most people I think most people are restricting, like most people at large, like the general population. Yes. And that's like the most straightforward thing to discuss, but it's not everybody. And then it's a different set of answers. But the way that we would address that population runs counter to how you might address the restrictive population. So that's why it's so tricky.
Yeah, exactly that. And, I think Steph and I have both I shared this with Steph before, like I'm doing a YouTube video about binge eating where I'm talking about not restricting and someone will go, that's such a great weight loss tip. And I'm like, what? What? Did you not hear? I try and mention it in pretty much every video about the restriction piece, but they hear it and they go, that's not me, which makes it extremely difficult for Steph and I to talk about this because we don't want to cause any harm. It's first do no harm, but then there are people being left out of the conversation.
Correct. That's what's so hard. And also I want to say that when we talk about things like even the question that that my client says like, oh, is this comfort eating or comfort? If you've got scarcity of food, which is usually a part of restriction, thinking that is going to feel really threatening. Like it's going to feel like someone's trying to take away my food. Someone's trying to suggest that I shouldn't want the comfort eating. Again, where you come, this is almost why like one-to-one coaching and therapy is probably a lot easier than talking on a podcast because you can take a person's unique situation and be very, very careful with somebody around what they need, whereas when we're talking to a large audience of people, there's a landmine for one person and a light bulb for another. That's why we clarify, I think, everything we say so much, or we try.
Yeah. One thing I just wanted to comment on the snacking after dinner thing. I've mentioned this before, but I think I mentioned it in an Ask Us Anything or in our community. So you have to stop me or at least just tell me if I have mentioned it on an episode before. But I think that there is like a tendency based on our early feeding experiences or because of restriction or whatever it is that you've gone through, like this conditioned into your eating cycle, if you like, that some of us from a nervous system or biology perspective like to go to bed with full stomachs. We sleep better with a full stomach. Was that on here?
It was on the community call.
It was a community call, right? Okay. Whereas some people going to bed with a full stomach actually interrupts or impedes their sleep. And I'm not talking about binge full because that's going to impede most people's sleep. But it could be from all kinds of early feeding experiences that if you have food in your stomach, it's easier for your whole system to decompress for sleep. So if this is you, there's this whole idea, isn't it, that, you shouldn't eat after 7 or you shouldn't eat after 6 because you're not going to have time to burn it off. Or if you eat stuff late in the evenings, it just turns straight into fat or whatever it might be. There's all that kind of misinformation out there. And I think looking back on your own experience, just asking yourself now, are you somebody who prefers to have finished eating a few hours earlier because that is what will make you sleep better? Or do you tend to sleep better if you've had a snack or even if you've had a later meal? And can you work with that rather than fighting that? Because I think that there are some people out there who might be fighting this, trying to
Mm.
eat earlier when it's almost not how they're wired, and they would
Yeah.
benefit from just moving everything back a bit later.
Yes. I,
Just like you've noticed the benefit of moving everything forward for you.
yeah. Yes. 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 It's so interesting because it's like, I'm also thinking about how it is important to recognize what your biology might be doing, which can take a really long time, like to figure out what your preferences are or what your biology is asking for. Because I also have found, I think I've talked about this on an episode too before, but when I have my snack, an evening snack or a sweet or something, right after my dinner, I'm so much more satisfied, and I don't even think about food for the rest of the evening versus if I were to do that separately. And the reason I figured that out is by staying with other people where they separate their dinner from their like sweet, and it changes the way that I want food. So like I will feel very snacky after dinner if I don't get like my like a kind of like a sweet hit at right after. I'll just keep wanting to graze or even
Mhm.
eat more dinner. Whereas if I close out my dinner with a sweet, I'm like rounded out. And then I'm like, I am good, and I
Mhm.
can, and it's just like noticing these little things. Also, I have a client who this speaks to something a bit different, but it's a different way that the biology might be speaking, who basically arrives to dinner time and the post dinner time, gives her kid a bath. Like it's like this busy, 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 and moves right from there into like a food response. And it's like the brain never had time to shut off. Like it's not had time to decompress. It's just still running on this habit track of fastness. So I might have spoken about this, but we injected stretch. She likes to stretch. Like that's something she does every in the morning. So I was like, what if you did that in the evening as well, post putting your child to bed? And so she started incorporating this 5 minute stretch, which is not going to work for a lot of people. But for some people, she was like, it slowed me. It kind of reminds me that I'm a person who had a day and I need to decompress. And just that has been an interruption of actually a binge purge cycle. So that has changed by, I would say, 60% the amount of binge purge that is going on in the evenings, because sometimes I think we are in the habit of being disconnected from ourselves. And that could be an emotional defense, which is not going to be fixed by the suggestion of stretching. But for other people, it may be a habit. And if it's a habit, that injecting small moments of connection with yourself can go a long way. Mm. Mm-hmm.
Mm. Mhm.
Mm-hmm. I am
Mhm.
hungry. And I mean it. I'm really hungry.
Oh, well, get yourself a little
I'm gonna
snacky
eat
snack.
soon.
Yeah,
Just that is neither here nor there. But I think we might be done.
I think we might be done.
All right.
All right. Good
Okay
chats.
then. Good
See you
good
later.
times. See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.